Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. I'm Jonathan Ferro, along with Lisa Abramowitz and Anne-Marie Hordern. Join us each day for insight from the best in markets, economics and geopolitics. From our global headquarters in New York City, we are live on Bloomberg Television weekday mornings from 6 to 9 a.m. Eastern. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify or anywhere else you listen. And as always, on the Bloomberg Terminal and the Bloomberg Business app.
We begin this hour with stocks sitting near all-time highs. The S&P 500 approaching 6,000, notching its 49th record so far this year. Equities heading towards their best week of 2024 as Trump takes back the White House and Chairman Powell continues cutting interest rates. Joining us now, Mohammed Al-Aaron of Queen's College, Cambridge. Mohammed, welcome to the programme. I know you watched the news conference, so let's start there. What was your takeaway?
So 3 takeaways, John. One is, as expected in terms of the characterization of policy, a desire to maintain optionality. And then where I really felt for him, John, is not in his response to the questions vis-a-vis the president-elect, where Powell, the lawyer, came out very strongly. It is this sort of muddled view of what is going on and inability to pivot forward. So think of his responses to the question of decomposition of the bond yield. Think of his characterization of real wages. Does he want them higher? Does he want them lower? Think of his characterization of the labor market. And then that key question by Mike McKee when he said, you've looked backwards, what about forward? And Powell ended up talking backwards. And you get very strongly a couple of feelings, certainly I did, where I felt for him. One is he's become totally hostage to data. And two is that he is in this world of the 70s and 80s where once you are away from the extremes of really high inflation or the threat of deflation, that somehow he believed monetary policy can fine-tune outcomes. And we know that if you over-rely on demand management to fine-tune, you end up with all sorts of collateral damage. So I really felt for him, but not for the political reasons that most of the media is covering right now.
So, Mohammed, you've said this a few times, the lack of a strategic underpinning. Could you just provide some clarity on what you think that underpinning should be, given the lack of clarity we have about the so-called trifecta down in Washington, D.C., what policy might look like, the margins they'll work through, to get that clarity for 2025 and really to sit there in December, which I think we all agree is the much harder meeting, to make a decision on interest rates and to provide forecasts?
It shouldn't have been a harder meeting, John. It shouldn't have been a harder meeting because there was great clarity back in July. And you and I talked about this, that it was time to start reducing rates, that he could have done it 25, 25, 25. We were a distance from most estimate of the neutral rate, which is somewhere in the upper threes, I think. And there's a distance to go. And you reduce the restrictiveness of policy. Instead, we got no change in July, 50 in September, then a sense, you know what, 50 was a mistake. We got the 25. And now, as Lisa pointed out, probabilities are changing vis-a-vis December. You know, this is not what policy should be doing. But this is what policy ends up doing when you are excessively data dependent. You have a path towards closer to neutral. You have reasons why you should pursue this. And if the election promises tend to end up to be reality, then you could change your strategic view. But as he rightly said, we don't know how much of this will end up being actual implementation.
His strategic view, Mohammed, seems to be let's cut by 25, as they just did, and then maybe 25 again in December. And then the question really becomes a blank slate. He said that they will have more data to really make that assessment, putting the focus much more on CPI. Do you think it was a mistake for him to reintroduce the emphasis on the Fed's mandate of inflation after basically kicking it to the curb and focusing simply on the employment picture?
Yeah, it was such a confused discussion. I mean, he was pushed on core inflation 12 months because he had only focused on headline inflation, so the 2.1 versus 2.7. So he got a question, what about the 2.7 that you haven't mentioned? And then we got into the discussion of, is it 12 months? Is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? He himself previously had said, look at the 12 months number. Now we look at the 3 months number, the 6 month number, just like we went through so many definitions of core and super core and everything else. I mean, yes, he added confusion when there's actually little need to add confusion right now on that issue.
So what do you think the Fed should be doing? Ideally, if they were going to have a framework, what framework should they follow? And I say this as Jim Bianco over at Bianco Research says that right now, to cut rates again might be worse than transitory.
So I don't agree with that. I think that we are a distance away from what the neutral rate is. I think that inflationary expectations are relatively anchored, not at 2%, but you know my view that 2% is too low, and certainly now is too low an inflation target for this economy, unless you want to structurally weaken it in a significant manner. They should be on a path of, until we get significant new information on what's ahead, I stress what's ahead, we will be on a path for now of maintaining a 25 basis points cut. And the other thing I have stressed, it is time to get out of this framework they have, this mindset they have that they're the only game in town. They are not the only game in town. They should leave center stage right now and become more of an observer and wait to see what plays out. But, you know, once you are on center stage, you've been the only game in town for so long, it is really difficult to exit stage left.
So, Mohammed, that's your advice to the policymaker. Is your advice different to a market participant? Because markets, as you know, are anticipatory. The Fed, you've suggested, is overreactionary. So I want to understand from your perspective now what you would say to a market participant, whether they should be pricing in a big positive growth shock that could come with some additional inflation.
So I think the direction of travel is clear. More growth, slightly higher inflation, a higher public sector borrowing requirement, and a huge sucking sound where a lot of foreign capital will end up in the US. That is the direction of travel. What you've got to figure out, and it's hard, and that's why we've got a market, is the magnitudes of these things. But I think, John, the direction of travel is clear. The magnitudes are going to become clearer as we get firm indications, not only of what the policy proposals are, but who's going to implement these policies. The appointments are going to be very important going forward.
Couldn't agree more. Do you think this could be a bigger problem for the rest of the world than it will be the United States?
Oh, absolutely. This is a period in which U.S. dominance of the global system is going to increase, both for positive reasons and for negative reasons. In the short term, the rest of the world simply cannot build enough pipes around the U.S. They're trying, and they've been doing it, but these pipes are very small compared to the size of the U.S. Over the longer term, you will see more pipes being built around the U.S. at the core of the system.
Mohammed, the journalist yesterday in the press conference get A for effort for trying to get Jay Powell to talk about politics, but he wasn't going anywhere near this. Do you actually have concerns about the independence of the Fed?
So I would have gone even less. I mean, he gave the legal response. This was Jay Powell, the lawyer, coming out in a very strong way. If I had been him, I would have simply said, I'm not going to discuss this issue. I wouldn't have said no. I would simply say I would not have discussed this issue. Saying no opens up a whole new host of things.
Do you think saying no was hostile to the former president, going to be future president?
I think it wouldn't surprise me if it's viewed as hostile. I think what Chair Powell was trying to do is give the legal answer. However, it can be easily viewed as hostile, yes.
Based on your view of the U.S. gaining that sucking sound of capital away from the rest of the world, do you think that sucking sound will also go to finance the deficit in a way that really caps off yields, that doesn't really allow them to rise as high as some people are threatening, such as 5%?
Yes. I mean, so there's two interpretations of why yields came down. One is the market has revisited. The other, which I favor more, is that U.S. bonds relative to the rest of the world became really cheap, and people reallocated away. If you look at what happened to the differentials vis-a-vis the rest of the world, U.S. bonds in relative space, and most of the time, as you know, Lisa, this market solves in relative space in the advanced world. It solves more in absolute space in emerging markets, but in the advanced world, they tend to solve in relative space. And relative to other advanced economies, the US yields were looking very attractive.
Mohammed, it's wonderful to catch up with you, sir. We're lucky to get some time with you. Joining us now is Ryan Peterson of Flexport. Ryan, welcome to the program, sir. Let's start with this. How busy are you right now? And has business increased a ton over the last few weeks?
Yeah, well, not just necessarily because of the possibility of a Trump election, but we also have a looming port strike on the East Coast. Remember, they went on strike last month, but they got a 90-day hiatus, and January 15th, that contract ends. So all the East Coast ports, right before Trump gets elected, may go back on strike. And so a lot of people are trying to get goods in before that might happen. So there's always something in global trade.
Joe Biden was called Union Joe. How do you think the port negotiations will go under President-elect Trump?
Yeah, it's a really big question. It's sort of like who he listens to, because he himself says back in October made statements in favor of the union and saying, hey, they need the right to negotiate against these foreign companies. At the same time, his main advisor now, Elon Musk, has said, that the union's demands for no automation are ridiculous and need to be stopped. So it's a really big open question. Who's Trump going to listen to, and how does that play out?
Because of that dynamic, do you think these talks could really drag on, and how long could we see them dragging into 2025?
Well, that's one big concern. Is sort of the talks are happening 5 days before the inauguration, and so what's the current Biden administration's role, and how committed are they to making that happen? And then that's, of course, with the backdrop of tariffs, which you were also alluding to here in your intros. Trump's going to want to come in and have that priority, but it's very hard to govern when there's always something coming at you, right?
Ryan, just to zoom out a little bit, there is this question. You mentioned that things are getting very busy. A lot of people are front-loading some of their orders to get ahead of both whatever policy changes might come, as well as that potential strike. Can you give us some sense, some scope of just how much busier it is, how much rates are able to go up for you as people do try to get ahead of that uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, you're seeing volumes they're a little bit higher, but it's very hard to attribute to any one thing in this. It's a very complex, dynamic world. So I wouldn't want to say, the volumes are up this much because of tariffs or because of looming changes in policy. So I don't have a specific number to tie to it. That said, we've seen it every time. Whenever there's new tariffs, you see a big surge. You saw it with the Biden administration earlier this year when they increased Section 301 tariffs on Chinese steel, for example. That led to a big push, and ocean freight rates went up about 3x earlier this year. From long-run historical average, it costs about $2,000 to ship a container from Asia to the U.S. That went up to over $7,000 in the spot market this summer, and it was driven by that. It was driven by people pulling goods in both before the port strike and before the tariff. So we've seen this movie before, and we're probably heading right back into something similar.
I'd like to lead into this idea that we've seen this movie before. We've had the experience of the 2018 different tariffs that came to play, 2017, 2018. There's a real question about how much companies have already rejiggered their supply chains to adjust to a new reality, new pressures, a new focus on nearshoring and onshoring. How much have you seen a real shift in the patterns of your clients in terms of where they ship from?
No, it's been massive over the last decade, and not just driven by the tariffs, although that's a big factor, but also driven by labor costs. Chinese labor costs have gone up. It's good for the workers in China. They're getting paid more, but they're no longer the low-cost source of labor for the world. And so companies have been relocating. Companies that can have been relocating, especially Vietnam, India, Mexico have been sort of like three big winners, but many other countries too. And that said, there are a lot of supply chains where you just can't get it done outside of China. The manufacturing expertise, the ecosystem of component suppliers. And for that, I'm specifically talking about electronics. There are a few other sectors, but really the electronic sector has a real hard time moving manufacturing out of China. And then the other big factor, the other big industry here is e-commerce. Chinese e-commerce parcels so going direct to consumer all the way from China, are close to 50% of the world's air freight now. And that is already being discussed to shut that down or to impose tariffs on it. Remember, those fly duty-free under the current regulations. And even the Biden administration has, and the current CBP has a directive, Customs and Border Protection, has a directive to take away those tariff exemptions. That may make those non-competitive. So there's a lot of different factors here. And I think you'll see an escalation because remember, these new tariffs are on top of the ones that the Trump and Biden administration put in. They're not, it's not just oh, we're back to Trump's tariffs. Biden never took them away. And they'll be talking about adding on to those.
You mentioned Vietnam and you mentioned Mexico, and I just wondered, especially given some of the threats that we've heard from the Trump campaign, how much you see from the flows that Mexico is kind of a Trojan horse for Chinese goods, and the same with Vietnam.
Yeah, in both cases, you've seen exports from China to these countries increase by 20% over the last 2 years. And so that implies we're either moving goods there as raw materials into a manufacturing process, or in some cases, there's probably some fraud where they're just relabeling things and saying made in Mexico when it's actually made in China. I think it's probably much more of the former, much more of raw materials moving in. And so it's not necessarily, the market finds a way. You know, it's very hard to, when a country like China is so good at manufacturing, very hard for businesses to avoid using that. They're just going to have a competitive advantage, and the markets route around it. And the other factor here is that it's expensive. Trucking is expensive. So moving a container or a truckload of cargo from Mexico up to the United States is not cheaper than shipping a container from Vietnam to the United States. Ocean freight, the physics are unmatched. It's so much cheaper than land freight. So it's not necessarily that just because Mexico's closer in terms of distance that it's cheaper.
There's one sailing route I wanted to ask you about, given we are going to have a change of an administration come January. The Red Sea, do you think we're going to see more freight go through there?
We've already started to see a little bit of restoring of services through the Red Sea just in the last month, and that's before Trump, even anyone had an idea that Trump would win. Some carriers are starting to brave that. I think there's a real possibility for a breakthrough, but I don't have any insight into, what Trump might do with Iran or the Houthi rebels there. But I think you should expect a new set of initiatives, policies, and potentially military action, but very, very unclear. One interesting story I thought didn't get enough attention was that this allegation that the Houthis, the rebels in Yemen, or really the government in Yemen, has been taking bribes effectively and running a toll road to the tune of $2 billion a year from ocean carriers and ocean shippers to move cargo through as sort of a payoff to not shoot missiles at them. That's a really crazy development if true, and I'd like to see more about it. I don't have any sources on that other than reading it in the news.
Well, I know a reporter around this table that's going to chase that story a little bit more now, Ryan. Appreciate that. Ryan, let's do this again soon. This was super sharp. Really appreciate your time. Ryan Peterson there of Flex Sport. Casey of Signum Global Advisors writing, broadly speaking, we see Trump beginning his second term unrestrained. Republican trifecta, Supreme Court majority, popular mandate. This may be a once-in-a-generation chance for Republicans to enact sweeping change. Rob joins us now for more. Rob, good morning.
Morning.
Can we start with the trifecta? You think it gets done? What kind of margins are you looking for?
Really tight margins. I mean, it's going to be as tight, if not tighter, than what we're seeing currently. Of the 25 seats still to be called, I think Republicans very easily win or comfortably win 9 of them. So that gets them to 219. There are other seats Democrats will win, and there are about 5 or 6 seats that are absolutely toss-ups at this point. So the best Republicans can hope for, I think, is 220, maybe 221, but it looks a lot like it does today.
House Majority Whip Tom Emmer this morning in Punchbowl News says, I don't care if it's 218, 219, 220. I don't give a damn. As long as we have the majority, we're going to be successful. But if you have 218, basically everyone becomes a king, no?
Yeah, everybody becomes a king. I think it's worse for Elise Stefanik, who would like to be appointed somewhere else, and they don't want to deal with a special election in New York. At this point, that would take away their majority if it was that slim. But I mean, frankly, Donald Trump is president-elect, which means in the House, Donald Trump is king. I mean, they are going to take their shots not from Mike Johnson or anybody else. They're going to take them from Trump.
So besides Elise Stefanik, who may go over to the UN, what does the leadership look like in the House?
I think it's Speaker Johnson. I think it's Speaker Johnson will stay in his seat. He did what he had to do. I mean, he retained the Republican majority, very likely at this point. And you know, other than that, I frankly don't think it matters very much, because I think this will be a session in which legislation is done top down. It'll come from Trump. It'll come from the White House. And the Senate, very likely to fall in line. The House, probably even more so.
So what's the first order of business, the border or taxes?
I think it's the border. I think it's oil and gas, both through executive action. I think taxes will take a little bit longer, because we will see, I mean, it's not a budget negotiation between Republicans and Democrats. It'll be a budget negotiation between, you know, the center and the right of Republicans. And we'll see that done through budget reconciliation. That'll take a number of months.
What will the immigration proposal look like? Is it going to be mass deportations?
I think we will hear about mass deportations. I think it's very unlikely we'll see that in the short term, frankly, because it just requires so many billions and billions of dollars to do that there isn't an obvious path forward for mass deportations. I think very, very likely what we see is targeted deportations of, you know, illegal immigrants who have committed crimes on U.S. soil. We'll get, you know, pictures and videos of immigrants being taken across the border in buses, and we're very likely to see remain in Mexico reinstated. But deporting tens of millions of illegal immigrants, really, really hard to do without additional funding from Congress, which would take a lot longer.
You know, one of the most interesting conversations that we've had, I thought, was Representative French Hill yesterday, where we were talking about the budget deficit and his concern about it. And he is a Republican. He is a House member. He is a supporter of Trump, and he poured a lot of cold water over some of the proposals that we heard from Elon Musk and the feasibility of cutting $2 trillion of the budget so easily. So how much pushback will there be within even the Republican Party as far as expanding the deficit to the degree that some people project that the plans would do?
I think there will be some pushback, but I think almost necessarily we will see an extension of the Trump tax cuts, all of them, not just some of them. And you know, there really isn't any obvious spending to cut commensurate with that level of tax cuts. So otherwise put, I think we are going to see an expansion of the deficit almost necessarily.
So work through the kind of policies that were on the campaign trail that you think could get done. No taxes on tips. That happens?
Probably not.
You don't think that happens? Why not?
I think over the past 6 months, what we've seen is Donald Trump run, frankly, a phenomenal campaign. Of course, today we know it was a winning campaign. I think a lot of what he was discussing, does he want to get it done? Maybe. Are they priorities to get done in this first 100, 200 days where we'll see, you know, a bulk of the legislation get done? I think probably not.
So that's one policy. Corporate tax rate down to 15% with conditions. What about that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, the campaign talked about 20%, 18%. I think those were campaign ploys because, frankly, a corporate rate cut doesn't play very well among the working class. I think Republicans are going to do all that they can to get it down to 15%.
Let's talk about inside the White House. Susie Wiles was announced last night. Trump calls her his ice baby. Who else do you expect to join the cabinet?
We see Rick Grenell at State. If it's not Rick Grenell, it'll probably be from the Senate, maybe Rubio. It could also be Bob O'Brien, but I would tap Rick Grenell at this point. You know, we're all asking ourselves who Treasury is going to be. It's Scott Bessent, I think, is at the top of the list. But Howard Lutnick has, I think, become more popular in the campaign and transition teams over the course of the past week or month. So I would look at Howard Lutnick as well.
What do these names swirling around the potential cabinet picks for President Trump tell you about where his mind is and how maybe the next 4 years will play out?
Well, I think the Trump 2.0 team will be more ready to govern than the Trump 1.0 team was. I mean, we have to remember that in Trump 1.0, we also had a Republican trifecta. There was not a lot of major legislation that got done in that period before the midterms. I think we will see a different Trump administration with a lot more momentum, a lot more efficient, with or without Elon Musk, you know, really running the efficiency show. So what I think we're going to see is it's a technocratic cabinet. But it's also a cabinet very, very willing to implement Trump's policies.
You say a technocratic cabinet. Yesterday, Donald Trump came out with the plan to eradicate deep state and started talking about a series of measures to give him the ability to remove certain people, certain bureaucrats, as he calls them, different members of the government. How much are those some of the things that we can expect to hear versus the technocratic aspects that you're talking about?
Well, I think at a very high level, you know, top level cabinet positions, these people are really smart. These people have their hands in policy, and they're going to be ready to go. Underneath that, so I mean, some of the more professional but still policy-related jobs. Trump wants to ensure that those people are pursuing his agenda and not their own. The easiest way for him to do that is to enact something called Section F, which could allow for him to fire up to 50,000 policy-level positions sub-cabinet. Do we think he's going to fire 50,000 people, on January 20th, 21st? No. Do I think that that's a helpful threat for Trump to ensure that the people working under him and under his cabinet are pushing the ball forward? I think it is helpful. So I think we hear a lot more about Section F.
The reason why I ask this is because when you say ready to govern, that can mean a lot of different things. Is it pushing through legislation? Is it looking for the types of provisions that could allow some of these more dramatic provisions to go into effect? Which is it?
Well, I think first it will be done by executive action. And again, I think that the two opportunities for him to do that are on the border. Not so much major immigration reform, but border enforcement in particular. And I do think very quickly we will see that, Trump return to the drill, baby, drill talking points, opening up federal land for more, oil and gas production. Whether or not we see that in the market in the short term, I'm skeptical, but it is what it is. Second, on the legislative front, I think it will be tax focused. I think everything else sort of in the first 100 days probably falls to the wayside.
Rob, it's good to see you. As always, sir, thank you. Rob Casey of Signum Global Advisors.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, bringing you the best in markets, economics and geopolitics. You can watch the show live on Bloomberg TV weekday mornings from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. Eastern. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify or anywhere else you listen. And as always, on the Bloomberg Terminal and the Bloomberg Business app.